The night my father called me an embarrassment in front of half the city's real estate community. I was adjusting a microphone stand near the stage at the Aldridge. He didn't recognize me at first. The room was full, probably 160 people in cocktail attire, crystal glasses catching the chandelier light, the hum of important conversations about square footage and tax incentives and charitable giving. I was wearing a dark blazer, the same kind our event staff wore, because I'd been helping the team since 4 that afternoon. Nobody in that room knew I owned the building they were standing in. Nobody except my operations manager, and soon everyone else would. Let me take you back to where it started, because that night didn't happen in a vacuum. It happened because of every dinner, every holiday gathering, every casual comment my father had made over the previous 8 years about the choices I had made with my own life. My father built his name in commercial real estate. He's been in this city for over 30 years, knows every developer, every city council member, every zoning attorney worth knowing. Growing up, I heard his name spoken with a kind of respect that I thought only came with age. I wanted to earn something like that for myself. I just didn't want to inherit it. After I finished college with a business degree, my father sat me down at the kitchen table, the same table where he'd signed half his early deals, and told me I'd be starting at his firm the following Monday as a junior broker. Not a question, not even really an offer. He said it the way he said most things, like the decision had already been made and he was just informing the room. I told him no. The silence after that word was something I still think about. He set his coffee cup down very slowly, like he was trying not to throw it. I didn't want to walk into a career on the back of his name. I wanted to understand the industry from the inside out. I told him I was going to take a position in commercial property management. The operations side, not the deals. I wanted to learn what made buildings actually work. Tenant relationships, maintenance contracts, utility negotiations, city permitting, the slow, unglamorous machinery that kept properties functioning year after year. He looked at me like I'd told him I was dropping out to join a circus. "You have a business degree," he said. "And you're going to manage a building?" I said yes, and I did. The first job was with a mid-sized property management company that handled a portfolio of office and retail spaces across the metro area. The pay was modest and the work was relentless. I was on call for emergencies at properties with aging HVAC systems and landlords who'd deferred maintenance for years. I learned to read a lease the way a lawyer does. I learned to talk to contractors without getting taken advantage of. I learned how to walk into a room full of frustrated tenants and leave it calmer than when I arrived. My father called what I was doing managing leaky roofs. He said it at my aunt's birthday dinner one year, and everyone laughed. My stepmother patted his arm. My brother smirked into his glass of sweet tea. It became the family joke. Every Thanksgiving, every Christmas, every Easter brunch at the house, with the wraparound porch that my father was so proud of, someone would ask how the leaky roofs were coming along. My stepmother would press her lips together, trying not to smile. My brother would say something like, "Any interesting pipes this week?" and the table would laugh. At first, it stung. I'd drive home from those gatherings with my jaw tight, running through all the things I should have said. But somewhere around year 3, I stopped needing them to understand. The work was teaching me things that couldn't be learned from my father's conference room or his leather chair. I moved up, not because of who my father was, but because I had a reputation for solving problems that other people avoided. I became the person my colleagues called when a situation was complicated or a client was impossible. I understood buildings the way you can only understand them when you've spent years inside their walls, not just their lobbies. About 2.5 years ago, I started hearing about the Aldridge. The Aldridge was a historic event venue in the older part of downtown, a 1920s ballroom that had been, at various points in its life, a vaudeville theater, a supper club, a reception hall, and most recently, a high-end event space known for its original plasterwork and its incredible acoustics. The kind of place that photographs beautifully, and that people choose for galas and fundraising dinners and wedding receptions that need to feel important. It was also bleeding money. The family that had owned it for decades had passed it down to a grandson who had tried to modernize it, without understanding the operational costs involved in maintaining a building that old. The renovation had gone over budget. Then a series of vendor contracts, overpriced service agreements that ate into every event's margin, pushed the debt into territory that was becoming impossible to ignore. When I dug into those vendor contracts during my research, something caught my attention. Some of the original agreements traced back to a management consulting firm that had been connected to one of my father's longtime business associates. The rates were inflated in ways that would only make sense if someone on the ownership side wasn't paying close attention or had been persuaded not to look too carefully. I set that piece of information aside. I wasn't ready to do anything with it yet. Understanding the full picture would matter more than reacting too soon. What I did was start making calls. I had spent years building relationships with people who invested in real estate, not just for the returns, but because they cared about what happened to the communities around their properties. Careful people. People who thought long-term. I reached out to 3 of them and asked if they'd be interested in hearing about a rescue opportunity. They came to a meeting in my apartment, with takeout containers on the coffee table, and I walked them through everything I had found. They were in. We formed a limited liability company under a name that had nothing to do with mine. We negotiated quietly, through an intermediary, so that the current owner could resolve things without a circus of competing buyers making it worse. The deal took 5 months. There were moments when it nearly collapsed. A title issue that took 6 weeks to untangle, a financing gap we had to restructure twice, but it closed. The Aldridge was ours. I made one decision that surprised my partners. I kept working hands-on, the way I always had. I hired an operations manager named Adriana, who had run event venues for 15 years and who understood the building's rhythms better than anyone. I worked beside her team during events, troubleshooting things that came up, learning what our staff needed to do their jobs well. The 43 people who worked at the Aldridge didn't know they had a new owner who was walking the building with them every week. They knew the venue had been purchased, and that the new ownership was investing in repairs and better wages. They didn't know it was me. I wasn't ready for that to change anything. I wanted them to see results first, actions before titles. My father booked the Aldridge for his annual charity gala 7 months after we purchased it. I found out through Adriana, who brought me the booking inquiry, with a look on her face like she wasn't sure how to handle it. The client name was my father's firm. I thought about it for 2 days, then I told her to handle it the same way we'd handle any client. Standard contract, standard pricing, no special treatment in either direction. He spent weeks coordinating with our events team. He approved the menu, the floral arrangements, the audiovisual setup, the parking arrangements. He had specific requirements about the lighting on the stage, because he was giving a speech that evening, and wanted to look good on camera. He never tried to negotiate our pricing down, because our rates were fair, and the venue's reputation had already grown enough that he didn't feel like he had the leverage. He had no idea his daughter had approved every decision from 2 steps behind the scenes. The night of the gala, I came in at 4 o'clock to help the team with setup. We'd had a new sound system installed 3 weeks earlier, and I wanted to make sure the calibration was right for a room that size. I pulled on a dark blazer over my black slacks, same as the rest of the staff, and got to work. By the time guests started arriving at 6:30, the room looked the way it was supposed to look. The original plasterwork on the ceiling was lit from below, soft and warm. The round tables were dressed in white linen with low garden rose arrangements. My father had specifically requested garden roses because he'd read somewhere that they photographed well. The bar along the west wall was fully stocked. The stage where my father would speak later had a clean podium and a tasteful backdrop carrying the charity's logo. I was near the stage at 8:15, adjusting a microphone stand that had shifted slightly during cocktail hour, when I heard footsteps that moved differently from the rest of the room, more deliberate, like someone who was used to being watched. My father had seen me. I knew from the quality of the silence that followed, the way nearby conversations dropped in volume as people sensed something shifting, that this was not going to be quiet. He crossed the room toward me. I could feel it before I turned around. When I did, his face was a color I hadn't seen before, not just anger, something closer to humiliation being converted in real time into aggression. "What are you doing here?" he said, not quietly. The guests closest to us stopped talking. A city council member I recognized from local news turned toward us. A real estate developer I'd seen at industry conferences looked up from his drink. "I asked you a question," my father said, louder. "I am paying significant money to use this venue tonight. This is what they're sending me to manage the stage. You're out here adjusting equipment?" He wasn't finished. I look around this room, he continued, his voice filling the space in a way that made clear he wasn't planning to lower it. I see business leaders, elected officials, philanthropists, people who have actually built something with their lives. And my daughter is out here moving microphone stands like a stagehand. He shook his head with a slow, theatrical disappointment. You had every opportunity. I handed you a career. I handed you a path. You could have had a real seat at the table, and instead you're adjusting cables at someone else's event. This is the most embarrassing thing I've seen in 30 years of doing business in this city. The room was quiet in a way that felt physical. I didn't move. I kept my hands at my sides and looked at him and said nothing. Not because I had nothing to say, I had plenty. But I had learned, over the previous 8 years, that defending myself to him was like arguing with weather. He had decided what I was a long time ago. No words of mine were going to shift that decision. The truth didn't need my help anyway. It was already in motion. He mistook my silence for defeat. I could see it in the way his shoulders settled. A small relaxation, like a man who had just reminded everyone in the room where the hierarchy stood. He looked around at the nearest guests, and for one moment he looked almost satisfied with himself. Then a voice came from somewhere near the center of the room. I recognized her immediately. A woman in her early 60s who had been one of the most respected commercial real estate developers in this city for decades. She had a reputation for knowing what was happening in every significant property transaction in the metro area before anyone else did. She was looking at me and then at Adriana, who had come to stand quietly near the edge of the stage. "Excuse me," she said, and her voice was the kind that rooms listen to. "I'm sorry to interrupt. But isn't she the one who purchased the Aldridge? I was under the impression she's the new owner of this building." The room held its breath. Adriana stepped forward. She had been in this industry long enough to know what the moment called for, and she had it. She spoke clearly enough for the tables closest to the stage to hear her without straining. "Yes," she said, "this is Ms. Whitmore. She purchased the Aldridge 14 months ago and has led the full restoration of the property. She is the owner." My father laughed. It was a short, slightly strangled sound. "That can't be right. There must be some kind of mix-up." Nobody else laughed. Our legal consultant, who had been at the venue that evening, reviewing updated occupancy permit paperwork the city had returned earlier that week, walked across the room carrying a folder. He handed it to me without ceremony and asked if I could authorize the final signatures. I opened the folder, reviewed the last 2 pages, and signed where indicated. Then I handed it back. There was nothing dramatic about it. It was just the ordinary work of someone who owned a building signing paperwork that needed signing. But every person watching understood exactly what they had just witnessed. My father stood very still. The confidence he'd carried across the ballroom 60 seconds ago had left him the way air leaves a punctured tire, not all at once, but completely, and with no way to put it back. I looked around the room. These were people who had spent careers reading situations. They didn't need it explained. I took a slow breath, because I hadn't planned to say anything more, and then I decided the room deserved honesty. I told them I had purchased the Aldridge 14 months ago, through an investment group, because the building was heading toward foreclosure, and I wasn't willing to watch it disappear. I told them that 43 people had worked here for years, some for over a decade, and that they had kept this building alive through circumstances that were not of their making. They deserved a real chance to keep doing the work they were good at. I told them that when I reviewed the financial records during due diligence, I had found vendor contracts that had been inflating the property's operational costs for years. Those contracts had played a significant role in the debt that pushed the original owner toward bankruptcy. I said I was still working through the full history of how those contracts came to exist. I didn't look at my father when I said that last part. I didn't need to. I could feel the shift in the room, the quiet, collective adjustment in how people were understanding the evening, without watching his face change. The gala ended, the charity raised its money, the speeches happened, people went home. But the way they went home was different from what my father had planned. In the weeks that followed, I watched what happens to a reputation when the story people have accepted about a person turns out to be missing some important chapters. My father had spent 30 years building an image as someone who understood real estate from the inside, who made sound decisions, who had good judgment about people and situations. That image didn't collapse overnight, but the night at the Aldridge placed a visible crack in it, and cracks like that have a way of letting in light. Business partners became harder to reach. Investors who had been circling a new development project he was pursuing started asking more careful questions. A nonprofit whose real estate consulting my father's firm had handled for 7 years quietly moved that work to another broker. No explanation was given. None was needed. It wasn't that people decided he was dishonest. It was that they had watched, in front of 160 witnesses, how he treated his own daughter when he believed she had nothing, and they updated their picture of who he was accordingly. In business, how someone treats the people they believe are beneath them tells you everything about how they'll treat you when they decide you're no longer useful. At the Aldridge, things moved in the opposite direction. When the staff learned the full story, not just that there was a new owner, but that I had been working beside them for over a year before any of that was public, the reaction surprised me. I expected some resentment, maybe some employees who felt they'd been kept in the dark. Instead, there was a day or two of quiet, and then something shifted in how the building felt when I walked into it. The closest word I have for it is trust, not blind trust, something more earned than that. The kind that comes from watching someone actually show up, not just claim to care. Bookings at the venue grew steadily over the following year. We finished the last of the planned renovations, updated electrical throughout the back-of-house spaces, a fully modernized kitchen for catering operations, and the restoration of the original marquee on the building's facade that had been dark for nearly 2 decades. Operating costs came down as we renegotiated the inflated vendor contracts into agreements that were actually fair. For the first time in a long time, the building was profitable. Watching my staff work inside that stability was the part of the job that felt most real. There's something specific about seeing people do their work without the constant background hum of wondering how much longer it will last. They moved differently. They cared about the details in a way you only do when you feel like the details matter, and like someone above you believes they matter too. About 8 months after the gala, my father called. He asked if we could have coffee somewhere quiet. He sounded like a man who had been rehearsing what he wanted to say, and wasn't confident he'd remembered it correctly. I said yes, and I chose a place that was mine, a small coffee shop 2 blocks from the Aldridge, where my operations team held their morning check-ins, and the barista knew my regular order. He was already there when I arrived. He'd gotten there early, which was something I had never seen him do for anything in my memory. He told me he had made mistakes. He didn't go into detail. He was still not a man who found the language of accountability easy, but he said it plainly enough that I believed he meant it. He said he had not understood what I was building. He said he wished he had been different. I listened without interrupting. I had spent a long time learning how to do that, to let someone finish before deciding what to do with what they'd said. When he was quiet, I told him I forgave him. Not because the account was settled, but because carrying resentment had never helped me accomplish anything, and I wasn't going to let it start now. Forgiveness, I had come to understand, was something you did for your own peace. It wasn't a reward you handed someone once they'd suffered enough. But I also told him clearly, and I had been thinking about how to say this for a long time, that the version of our relationship that had existed before, where his opinion of my choices was something I had to defend, where his approval was the measure I was always falling short of, that version was finished. I was done explaining myself to someone who had spent years not listening. I was done making myself smaller, in rooms where he expected me to be small. We could be family, we could talk. I wasn't going to walk out of his life. But the terms had changed, and they weren't going back. He was quiet for a moment, and then he nodded. Not the quick, dismissive nod I'd seen 1,000 times, a slow one. He didn't argue. Our conversations after that were shorter and more careful, like 2 people who have decided to begin again with fewer assumptions between them. Not warm the way I used to hope for when I was younger, and still thought I could earn my way into his approval, but real. More real than anything we'd had at those holiday tables, where everyone performed for each other, and called it family. Not long after that coffee, I stood in the same ballroom, where he had called me an embarrassment, and spoke to a group of young people just starting out in commercial real estate and hospitality management. They were maybe 22, 23, sitting in chairs arranged near the stage, holding notebooks with that particular look of people who don't yet know what they don't know. I told them that every job in a building matters, that the people who keep operations running, who solve the problems that never make it into any meeting, who show up early and stay late without anyone watching. Those are the people who actually understand how a business works. I told them that learning from the inside takes longer and looks less impressive in the beginning, and that it is worth every single month of it. I looked around the room as I said it. At the plasterwork ceiling we'd spent 4 months restoring, at the marquee fixture above the entrance that had been dark for 20 years before we brought it back, at my staff moving between tables with the easy confidence of people who knew exactly what they were doing. I had spent a lot of years trying to understand why it had hurt so much when my father dismissed what I was building. Not because his opinion should have carried that much weight, but because I had let it. I had spent years performing competence in his direction, hoping he would finally turn around and see what I actually was. What I understood now, standing in a room that I owned, surrounded by people whose livelihoods were more secure because of decisions I had made, was that the moment I stopped needing him to see me, was the moment I started being able to see myself clearly. My greatest accomplishment wasn't the Aldridge, it wasn't the purchase, or the renovation, or the night the truth came out in front of the people my father most wanted to impress. Those were results, outcomes, they were real, and I was proud of them, but they were not the thing. The thing was something smaller and quieter, built across years before any of that happened. Knowing the value of my own work, before anyone else confirmed it. Knowing I was building something real even when the only people who thought it mattered were the ones doing it alongside me. That knowledge was mine from the beginning. No one gave it to me. And no one, not even my father at his loudest, in a room full of witnesses pointing his finger at everything he had decided I was, ever managed to take it away.